for the state of our political situation in our country and how it got there. What are the ingredients to it? What needs to be paid attention to and focused on? And that was basically after a few discussions, exchange of outline and some other with a lot of different thoughts that were not composed. We had a very interesting set of discussions, and then we agreed to start into writing the book. And we worked our way into the format of the critical areas that we think contribute to the book. And as a function of that, the chapters are oriented to the most important thing for people to think about is when you're engaged in conversation, you don't need to be concerned about being right. What you need to be concerned about is what are the issues and what's the information. And within that, critical thinking is the dominant issue. How do we think critically? I could take information, a person can present me all kinds of what their thoughts are, but is there critical information there that helps me expand my knowledge and come to better conclusions? That can be the case. It may not be the case. If you're critical thinking, you don't accept everything. But in the process, that was the first chapter. It's about critical thinking. Everything comes back to, can you think critically? And then the other chapters, we have education, which is primary. It says, how do we educate our seed corn, our children, let alone we all need to be continually educated. Religion, faith, values gets to the value issue of how we establish values. Then the history is we don't need to repeat mistakes. We don't need to, we do frequently. And then you have with those pieces of information, you now have the fundamentals to go into political systems and economic systems, and then understand the integration of how they function together, et cetera. So that was the bottom line overview of what we did and how we got there.
Yeah, Jeff, we concluded very quickly, over a few hours of conversation, that people can't even communicate today. And we cycled right back to that whole concept of critical thinking. Everybody's spouting what they were told, what they learned, what they listened to, and with total acceptance, without any sort of critical thought. And if you look carefully at a lot of things across the country, people are beginning to understand that critical thinking is vital for communication to occur. Otherwise, people set themselves up for failure. They don't want to discuss things. They get angry. They get up from the table. They leave. It's a disaster. And one of the important foundations of getting to that critical thought process is, as you just suggested, education. If you study civilizations back thousands of years, education has been absolutely seminal to keep a civilization growing. Without education, even as it's reserved for the elites until the last couple hundred years, which it was, you literally, if you don't have the educational process of passing on your thought and knowledge to the next generation or generation after generation, you won't succeed. You'll go from bondage to bondage after a number of steps in between. And then, of course, the misinterpretation of history, the manipulation of history, you're into George Orwell. And as Kevin said, then you get into the process of political hijacking. You get into the process of economic systems are hijacked for the purpose of political support, all of which came out of the first year or two of discussions as we wrote.
Yeah, and that's really incredible. First of all, when you think of the whole idea of critical thinking, the first thing that comes to my mind is the minute you make a concession, the minute you say, you've made a good point, people think it's perceived as a sign of weakness. And it's not. I always say, I'm not a fan of what's going on today, but I say he is the guy that's swinging the bat harder than anybody, like the Reggie Jackson of baseball. He also hits more strikeouts than anybody else. But the fact of the matter is, he is the guy that's trying a lot of different things. And when I even give him that little bit of credit, which is obvious, it's there, it's plain to see that Democrats just want to run me out the back door of the room. You're just, and then when I say, something like Andrea Ocasio-Cortez, who I never use the acronym because I always wonder if it's another obnoxious child for the acronym, not her, but she makes like she took this oath of poverty, and yet still she's doing very well at this point. She went from a bartender to doing very well. And even just the job, she has a lot of elite things right there at your fingertips, a private transportation system, a cafeteria that I would call something like Burns Steakhouse. So suddenly, you've got to come to the realization that both sides are, you just take what's good from both sides. But there is, again, that perception of sign of weakness when you try to point that out, that
Well, that's a sign of intelligence versus non-intelligence, Jeff. If someone think that the sign of weakness, they're not very intelligent. I mean, anybody that says something that has achieved something and they've done it nicely, they know how to state things diplomatically. That's an art. Some people are skilled at it, some aren't. They'll hit you with a sledgehammer. I find it interesting. I can learn something on occasion from someone that uses a sledgehammer, but it's not an immediate indication that I'm dealing with a real bright person.
Right. Well,
You
yeah.
you talked about, you use sports analogies, which we have in the book. You probably remember it. There was a coach of Cal Poly in 1989. He gave a speech. He spoke about this often as he did his coaching career of baseball, John Scalinos. And a long story short, we don't change the configuration of home plate to match how good or bad a pitcher you are. But it gets strikes. It hasn't been changed in dimensions since 1950. Now, that is 75, 76 years long. So, and he applied that to his family, to marriage, to his children, to teaching, to mentoring. He applied it to everything he did, which speaks to the religion, faith, and values chapter of the book, where there are some eternal truths. You need a structure that carries you forward, as opposed to situational ethics, where every day's a new day. I'm going to decide what I want to do.
Well, yeah, and that value, one of the things I've said is when we think of that value, that religious value, whatever your religion is, right?
Right.
Whatever your religion is, it's something and so I've talked to Jackson Lahamer, who wrote a book about the president's faith office. Donald Trump made a commitment to the Christians around the country that he would open a faith office because they felt Christians were being targeted pretty much primarily by the RRS. And Donald Trump, and I said, now that we've got this in position, can we get the church to do other things? Can we get the church to start bringing in young people and possibly feeding them a hot meal or helping them with their homework and stuff like that, and engaging them in that faith-based thinking? Because wouldn't that do America a lot of good? Without, because what we're missing here is even though you may not adopt everything Christian, or you may not agree, you may agree with everybody's perception of Christianity, but if you have that faith in your heart, if you have that inner peace, won't you get further along in life?
I couldn't agree more, Jeff. I think that one of the terms we use in the book is fabric of society. And one of the questions is, how do you create the fabric of society? How do you strengthen it? It is a term that refers to the fact that society living in one nation under whatever political structure has been created, is the population at large becoming more and more cohesive because there's a cooperative process, there's an appreciation for the fellow man? Or is it getting weaker because everybody's in self-interest? I understand, how do I manipulate the game? How do I cheat at this, cheat at that? But that's okay because I come out a winner. The fabric of society is doing one of two things because it's dynamic. It's either strengthening or it's weakening. It's not remaining static. And so what is a critical ingredient for taking the fabric of society and helping it strengthen? Well, in my opinion, the term the fabric of society is great because it is the exercise of one's value system that allows the strengthening to occur. And if we don't have something as an anchor, a value system, what are we doing? Well, I look at it in the terminology. You've got religious, and that process, we say religion, faith, and values. The bottom line is, what does religion or faith do? They work towards a value system. Okay. You may arrive at a good value system. If you want to be an atheist, you could be a very good person. I'm not saying that you can't be, but the anchor for society at large for millennia has been religion. Okay. Well, there's a purpose behind that, and it's good and it's solid. And we're Christian. I'm a Christian. So is Peter. But you could be anything else. We're not concerned about what religion you're in. We're concerned about what your value system is.
Right.
Are you trying to work and live within harmony with your fellow mankind? We've all made mistakes. We've all made probably some pretty big mistakes. And if you're introspective, you look at it and say, that was a big mistake. I'm not repeating that one. I've learned from it.
And that, Jeff, to your point, it ties into education, because that's what's passed on generation to generation. That's the value system, how we're defined. The cohesion of society is kept together and it's allowed to grow because you have that system, however defined. And if you don't have that system, however defined, you might as well be in the corner with Nietzsche, where everything is meaningless. And
Right.
if everything's meaningless, the last 20 years, 30 years, now you have identity politics because I am meaningless. My life is meaningless. Therefore, I'm going to create my identity that I want. And boy, you better believe my identity or I'm not going to talk to you anymore. As you see
And
how
that's what's happening. Is
what's
just
happening.
that is we're either agreeing or we're just you're with me or you're against me.
Right.
And there's not necessarily
It's tribal. I mean,
it's
it
tribal.
used to be that you're a Republican, Democrat, moderate, conservative, all those kind of things that kind of blended together. And you could be a conservative Democrat, you could be a liberal Republican. I mean, those existed at one time, but we've moved away from that. So now everything is tribal, and you either agree with me because I'm in this group, or we are at battle. And it's an absolute tragedy because, as you stated earlier, there are things to learn from each side. Now, we think that if you go about it logically, which get out of the emotion is what hurts. If one can think about something logically, then one can start adjusting. And in the adjustment, it's helpful to the emotional side. If you're going to analyze things and do it emotionally, you're not going to come to good conclusions. You're just reaching an emotional decision. And that's not wise.
Well, right. And so to that point of emotional, right? Whenever you think of Donald Trump and his wrecking ball, people are always pointing out that he decimated this program or he decimated that program. But I've always pointed out it has come to a time where we've gone too far with too many programs. And there may be a need of rethinking. And there's a lot of argument on both sides of that coin. But there is this, and then there was this disdain for Elon Musk and Doge. And I said, Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency shouldn't have just went away. We should have a Department of Government Efficiency. It maybe should have been done differently. We should have, from two military guys, right? We understand now drones cost a lot less than F-16s and may be able to accomplish a lot more, right? But then you have this political system where if you tell a certain contractor that's in Mississippi, we no longer need your F-16, some congressman's going to go, I need that donation money. Keep that contract going forever and don't replace it with $3,000 drones.
I think you hit on one of the biggest points that exist in the problem of government today. They put in place a policy that's supposed to be temporary. Have you ever seen a temporary government policy? And then they put in this they said, well, we're going to divvy this out to all these different districts so they all buy into it. And so that's a corporate policy to do that so that they get the congressional support. That we're not, in that case, what I think is strong about the United States is basically it's one of the fundamental meritocracy structures in the world, but it's not perfect. And so we're not using meritocracy as well as we might. And in that process, we've learned how to abuse it. And so the lobbyists abuse it, the congressmen abuse it. They're not in it for, I mean, look at the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act says we want to have a proof of citizenship and need an ID in the process. You go to political functions and the politician, Maxine Waters, whatever, you need an ID to get into her function. Well, what's more important, going to her function or voting? I would say voting is more important. So if she says on a consistent basis, which is one of our litmus tests, is it consistent? You then say, okay, if you think an ID is necessary to get into your event, then what is the key to having a successful voting process? And that to me is integrity. And integrity means let's establish some provisions for creating an integrity process to voting. Well, that's the SAVE Act right now. 85%, if I read it properly, support this. Well, what does that mean about a representative government if the politicians, all these representatives, are not facilitating the passing of a law that's agreed to by Republicans and Democrats? And so we're not being represented well when that occurs. They're doing a pretty lousy job when 85% wants them. That's not just a super majority. It's incredible majority.
Right.
So, Jeff, you can see how we kept coming back on our conversations. For example, just put on paper 38 trillion in debt, that's a couple $100 trillion that are unfunded obligations and Social Security and pensions and so forth. Put all of that on paper. That there is no growth rate that you could ever truly visualize that could grow our way out of that problem. So you're looking at a train wreck. You're looking at a huge wall into which you're going to run and crash. Now that's critical thought applied to an economic situation that comes out of the political structure that did not pay attention to history, that did not pay attention to the hijacking of education. That's the result of the subtitle of our book, Hijacked, Our Republic, which is a representative of form of government, not democracy per se, our republic with 3 houses, Congress, Senate, judicial, and legislative, executive. You come around the barn, and if you don't work your way out of that situation, if you don't critically think what is going on in front of us, you'll run into that wall before you know it. That's where we kept coming back to what's wrong? Why aren't we looking at this the right way?
We're both got a little bit of a financial background, so we tend to look at things and understand finance with good reason. And so we say, well, what does it pass certain tests? And as Peter said, financially, it doesn't pass certain tests. Now that gets back to what we just said earlier than that was, is it sustainable? We say, is there in a process, if you've got a problem and you've identified a real problem, not a solution. So you have to go through that question am I dealing with a symptom or am I dealing with the actual problem? So you identify distinguish between those two, you identify what you hope is the real problem, and then you come up with solutions. Manpower's ability to do quantum leap logic. We go out on the decision tree and say, that's the answer. Well, there are some people that are in fact with vision powers actually skilled at that. And then the process goes like, well, if we're going to implement it, how do we get back? Well, it's a reverse decision tree. Trees have acute angles for most of the branches, most trees. And as a function of that, if you just follow your way back from the answer, you'll find the most efficient path to get to the trunk. Well, that's reverse analysis. But if you use reverse analysis wisely, we've identified a problem, we've identified some solutions, then we go, okay, we've got a group of solutions. What is the best sustainable solution? What is consistent so that it is fabric